Greetings ladies and gentlemen, Adrian here. Welcome back to the channel and to another MMORPG review from a new player perspective, and this time for NeoWiz's Bless Online. Before we begin, here's some background. While it may have launched globally on Steam recently, this game isn't exactly new. There have been a few iterations of Bless Online that exists in other regions, notably in Korea where it was made, with other versions shutting down in recent years. A telling sign or just bad luck? Anyway, Bless Online is an Asian fantasy MMORPG heavily inspired by medieval themes and takes place in a pretty large world where two playable factions rule, the Huron and the Union. The game centers around PvP and PvX dungeons for endgame content and is buy to play, unlike the Korean version. And now that you know a little bit about what Bless is, let's dive into the review, beginning by taking a closer look at the game's combat system. One of the reasons Bless Online took a while to arrive on the global market is because of revamps to the game's combat system. Initially, an all-action cam combat mode, NeoWiz changed things up by adding in their words, a more dynamic combat system for all classes which involves combo chains that increases in tiers, giving players choices of what skills to use at each tier. This is quite the departure from more conventional MMOs that lets players fire off whatever skills they've unlocked on their hotbar in whichever sequence they want. The game's 5 classes at launch all use this combo tier combat system where you unlock more skills to use each tier you gain levels, in addition to the stances which alters the basic stats or archetype of your class. For example, I leveled a paladin for this review and I have one stance for DPS and the other for healing. You can swap between stances in combat with a 10-second cooldown, and your skill chains will alter as well depending on what stance you're in. All but the Berserker class are pretty much standard this way, as the Berserkers have a more action combat cam mode that players will be familiar with. From the month that I've spent with Bless, the combat system is Jekyll and Hyde for me. On one hand, I like the combo tier system in that it is an interesting mechanic, having been exposed to plenty of other MMOs that played safe with standard combat systems. In harder fights such as dungeon bosses, it really makes you think about which stances you need to swap to at which points of the fight, and how to get that hard-hitting tier 3 combo finisher skill or heavy group healing skill. The bad part is just the overall execution. Instead of making the combat feel more actiony, it actually feels static and bland, and having to wait a while before you get to a higher tier skill, and trying to hit the right combo keys is such a klutz. At times, you do feel like you're really missing a traditional combat feel where you have all the skills at your disposal immediately when the fight begins. With Bless, there's lots of waiting around for CDs, firing off wrong chains by accident, and a whole lot more. The combat system, in addition to the stiff animations for executing attacks, is one combo that becomes repetitive all too quickly. For crafting in Bless Online, it's as simple and non-complicated as they come. Players will be able to pick up crafting professions in their faction's main hub via the in-game tutorials, and there's 3 of them to choose from. There's armor smithing, jewel crafting, and enchanting, with 2 secondary professions such as cooking and alchemy. Each character you have can only master one of each, so if you want to craft, it'll be handy to level alts. They're pretty much self-explanatory, and they all have handy things about them. Armor smithing, for example, lets you craft portable repair kits, while enchanting creates taming scrolls, which is super popular and sells well in the marketplace. Crafting is as simple as finding the resource nodes out in the world and heading to a crafting station back in town to make what you need. Leveling a profession will take time as there are tiers to rank up, as in most MMOs. To offset this, players often get into groups for a group-wide crafting XP bonus buff, and occasionally there will be in-game events that turn on buffs as well. Crafting aside, other character progressions in-game is standard pretty much. Character progression is tied to your character level per usual, and the level cap currently is 45. To level, players will earn experience points through questing, running dungeons, and killing monsters out on the landscape, and we'll talk about Bless's content in the next section. For gear progression, Bless utilizes the enhancement system that players will be familiar with if they've spent time in other MMOs such as Black Desert Online and Terra. Gear such as weapons and armor come in a few rarities from white all the way up to purple, and along the way players will farm dungeons for blue leveling gear, which they can then enhance to higher levels in town using orbs and other materials you get from deconstructing armors and weapons you don't use, such as for other classes. As usual, This enhancing is heavily based on RNG and will fail past a certain level. This system makes use of the game's few dungeons, and players will be farming them for gear drops whether you like it or not. To round up the more profound and noteworthy progression systems in game is the Mount and Pet collection, which has its own section, so onward we go to the next talking point. To wrap up progression, one of the main things you'll definitely be wanting to do is PvP and dungeons for the points you earn, which in return can be used as currency in the in-game cash shop, which is a nice touch. NeoWiz promised a bunch of things in the lead up to the Steam launch regarding PvE content, such as story-centric dungeons and group-friendly content. Have they delivered? Let's start with the basic PvE content. First of all, there's the game's main story, which begins after the intro tutorial and lasts all the way to the level cap. These are a great source for character XP points and gold, but are level gated and players will have to hit a certain level before they can pick up the next chapter of the story and move on. Other PvE content also relies on the player having hit a checkpoint in the main story to begin doing, such as region side quests from NPCs or hunting quests, which are similar to Final Fantasy XIV's duties where you kill a certain amount of monsters for XP. Both side quests and hunting quests are optional to all players, but from my leveling experience, you definitely want to do them as much as you can, as just following the main story quests will not give you enough experience points to progress. This is where the game's PvE becomes a bore fest and annoying really quickly for a couple of reasons. One, the quality of the game's side quests is on a couldn't be bothered meter. They're lazily written, featuring fetch, kill, and escort quests that seem to stack every region. Just the names of the NPCs and the monsters change, but the formula doesn't. And number two, the game's combat system, as I said earlier, can become really repetitive, especially when you're leveling, having access to only 2 stances and 12 skills. And when you have 50 plus monsters to kill to complete a hunt quest, you sometimes just end up watching TV for the night or playing another game instead. This can be mitigated if you are in an active guild and everyone hunts together, of course, but that again requires players to have met a criteria of progressing the main story up to a certain point, or else not everybody in the group at that point in the story will get credit for kills or even XP. To sum up the landscape content in a sentence, in my opinion, it's subpar and incredibly linear, which is frustrating because Bless offers a lot of promise. Rounding up the PvE are dungeons, and Bless has quite a few that players will come across while leveling for both factions and their respective maps. The first 2 are apparently soloable, and having streamed it live, I can confirm that they can be soloed for the boss chests, which grants that all-important loot. I like the dungeon designs as they're traditional crawlers, and it is tied to the game's story somewhat, which is nice if that is important to you. Where the game falls short again is with how combat feels in dungeons, especially in smaller groups or solo. Clunky, repetitive, rinse and repeat. And oh my, you will repeat, as the game was designed in a way that players will farm dungeons as it's the best source of XP points early on. Because remember what I said about the main story having level gated checkpoints? This is one surefire way to ensure that you over-level and not be stopped along the way. I ran about 12 dungeons each from the first 2 dungeons before I started the story all the way into the level 40 plus areas. One thing to note about dungeons as well is that you will definitely come across players of the opposite faction, which means open world PvP. If you don't have a declaration of peace, which makes you immune to being attacked for 10 minutes, expect to be ganked. Some of your questing from following the main story will also take you into contested map zones, which simply means both factions are questing there, and there will be PvP, so keep that in mind. And recently, the new Royal Quests has also been patched in to offer more things to do at endgame, which is undeniably barren at the moment. Royal Quests are basically dailies for gift boxes, so in the end, you may or may not be satisfied with the current endgame content if you are not a fan of PvP. And finally for content, let's get to the PvP stuff, and we've already talked about the open world PvP. Ganks and Zergs are definitely a thing, having been on the receiving end a few times. But there's also structured RVR arenas to do as well at level 30 and above. There's the Peninsula War, which will launch with release, and it's a fun 15v15 team match, all about point control. There's the smaller Siege of Castra, and the newly launched Basil Gorge, which involves base storming, and all of them are worth doing if you are at the level cap for PvP combat points. I've done them while leveling and it's not worth it, simply because the majority of the player base are already at the level cap, and it's not a fun experience being the low-B undergeared player in the group. And if you are wondering, no, none of the modes are balanced, so if you're not geared, you're not winning. Let's talk about Bless Online's classes next. For this review cycle, I did something different, whereby I leveled a bunch of classes into the early areas as opposed to just one class to get a feel for how they were designed and how they function. At release, Bless has the Guardian, Ranger, Berserker, Mage, and the Paladin. I picked the Paladin as my main because that's my favorite MMO archetype, and I've tried out the Mage, the Berserker, and the Guardian as well. Since launch, Bless has done a ton of tweaks to classes, from nerfing and buffing damages to increasing cooldowns on flavor of the week skills and so on, that it's become hard to surmise my thoughts on the state of the game's classes at the moment. At launch, many of them were broken. Guardians and Mages were incredibly OP, for example, and at current time they're now just okay in terms of what they can do in landscape or in dungeons prior. It's still a balancing act since Bless is hiding behind its early access moniker. For the Paladin, it's the only healer in the game presently with the Mystic class not available yet, and so is the Assassin, so at least we do know that more classes are coming. But based on my experiences of playing some of these classes regardless of Trinity or Archetype, I found the Berserker to be the most fun to play because it uses a proper action cam combat system for starters, has more AoE skills than most of the rest, and its mechanics involve rage building that just felt natural. It's a shame that after recent updates they hit like wet paper and are glass castles. Some classes like the Ranger just felt like it had an underwhelming mechanic and took a while to get going. For a plus point though, I do appreciate that the classes are not gender locked at character creation, which seems to be a favorite thing to do for Asian MMOs. The Lumina shop is Bless Online's in-game cash store, and Lumina is the game's premium currency which can be bought for real money or exchanged from other in-game tokens such as gems and points. That's the cool thing that I as a player appreciate. In the cash store, you'll find the absence of an RNG loot box, which is again thumbs up, and majority of the items can already be found in-game without the need to even open the store. Some items like an additional tactic slot to add more character build saves are on there though, so those become things to spend money on if you really want to. There's mount and pet skins, player outfits, and other convenience items that really doesn't come across as pay to win, which is what NeoWiz promised to offer from the get-go. From a graphical point of view, Bless Online is actually rather nice to look at, and as a player, I'm somewhat charmed by the aesthetics of the world and Hans Zimmer's music that plays in the background. It's not a modern day game by all accounts, having been around for a while, but it does hold up and the big towns look really well designed. I regret to inform you curious folks, however, that all the pre-launch warnings of an empty world is indeed a real thing. There's just tons of wasted space on the landscape that just begs for some more artificial life forms or scripted monsters to populate it. When traveling around via wyverns, you do see this a lot, and it can be an eyesore. While having decent graphics and such are nice, it's really ruined by poor optimization. You know it, I know it, the MMO world knows it by now. Bless runs like crap and have been running like crap since launch. With or without the player INI file fixes and OpenGL tweaks, this game suffers in the optimization department, and while the devs have stated on Steam that it's still a priority, let's be honest, it's not. Content is king and they must focus on that first before they fix other parts of the game, but trust me, the damage has already been done. Does Bless Online have a main story, and is it any good? NeoWiz's MMO does indeed have a main narrative beginning from the tutorial for each of the two factions, but you can only play as one faction on one server. Having picked the Union faction, that's the extent of my experience, and the story involves plenty of politics between Union leaders and territories, bandits, hidden agendas, backstabbing, and it all revolves around a demonic dark tower that needs to be taken down for the sake of all in the world. The main story quest starts off painfully slow as players take part in a quest hub crawl to move the main story along from map to map, and we already know parts of this is level gated, so oftentimes there are periodic gaps in between. The writing is nowhere near AAA quality, so don't expect witty dialogue lines or captivating narratives here. What impressed me were the quality of some of the main story cinematics, which were impressive. When you're out in the world and walking up to an NPC to do the main story quest, the surrounding area also becomes instanced to you, and that's some handy tech to keep out others from ruining your story progression. For the entirety of the main story, NPCs talk to you and they're fully voice acted, but it must be said that the quality of the voice acting does suffer a lot. Whoever makes the sound audio for Bless clearly didn't get a second pair of ears here, and the written text did have numerous spelling errors and such at release, which thankfully has been fixed since, but again, the damage has been done considering it's the first impression for a lot of new players that would experience that at the start of the game. Overall though, the main story on the Union side did get a lot better towards the level cap as the story started to make more cohesive sense and it finally treated you like an intelligent protagonist rather than a bystander in this political war that you have no idea how you're roped in to begin with, and things start to pick up in urgency. But ultimately, it's definitely not one of Bless's main strengths, and it comes across as a insert story mode here gimmick, and besides the good XP amounts and content unlocks, it feels that Bless would rather highlight other aspects of its game. From a social standpoint, Bless Online has few systems in place that actively encourages players to get in groups more than most games. The game's party buff system lets the group leader select 2 buffs, one for combat and the other for the life category for things like bonus XP for example. This has been a good way for players to get into groups on the landscape for the damage and XP buffs without even needing to play together. You might see that as, hey, that's pretty cool, but I find that really odd. Here I am in a party of 5 and we're all forced into a party but no one talks, everyone is doing their own thing on the landscape, and when someone drops, the leader just pugs another to fill in the spot, rinse and repeat. It's nice getting access to bonus buffs out in the world when you're a solo player, but it's weird how you're forced into it to begin with. The game's guild system is pretty ordinary and has progression as well, with guilds earning XP and using that to turn on guild-wide boons as well. For the community in general, you do get the sense that a lot of the raucous crowd from launch, those demanding for refunds or just sticking around to troll the genuinely loyal player base, has since moved on, making map chats slightly better. Otherwise, the community on my server is literally spamming for parties all day long, with the occasional niceties in help chat. Speaking of servers, as of this recording, NeoWiz will be consolidating servers, so that gives you an inkling that the player base has dwindled a ton since launch, and while that is a negative, it's a good initiative for the studio to get started on merging worlds ASAP to salvage who's left. Coming to the tail end of this Bless review now, and you might get the sense that a large portion of what this MMORPG has to offer is somewhat underwhelming. That's pretty much how I felt leveling day in and day out since release, but Bless Online does have a system that I found to be one of the good things that I experienced out of all of this, and it is their taming system. In Bless, almost every creature you come across out in the world can be tamed as a mount or pet, and it's one of the coolest things an MMO can have really. All it takes is to have the appropriate level of taming scrolls and then you start a minigame, which is easy enough to do, and you now have a sweet new ride, from giant spiders to ogres, and of course, flying mounts included. It works the same way for pets, and both mount and pet collection then becomes a progression in its own, as mounts have XP bars that level the more you use them, and you can enhance them to get better skills to move faster or things of that ilk. It's fluff if you really think about it, and doesn't have a lot to do with your character besides just moving faster out on the landscape, but it's still a system, the system in fact, that I've had the most fun with in Bless Online. So on to the all-important question then, and if you are a new player wondering if Bless Online is worth the time and money, I'll say this. In its current state, it's better holding off and waiting to see how the game changes either for better or for worse. There are a bunch of buy-to-play MMORPGs out there right now that offers loads more fun in terms of content, community, and endgame than Bless currently does. Yes, it's in early access, but studios pay the price for hiding behind the early access price tag because we are all unforgiving Grim Reapers who've been spoiled by other games setting the standard so bloody high as it is. And if you can't match that bar as a studio or don't show the aspiration to match the level that players expect from the MMO genre, then prepare to see the backlash like the MMO community showed towards Bless. Again, if you are really interested, wait for more fixes, more endgame content, better optimization, and probably a discount on Steam before you jump in. If not, disregard my opinion for what it is, an opinion, and jump in to form your own. That just about wraps up my in-depth look at Blast Online from a new player perspective. If you've been playing Blast and have a different view, feel free to share them in the comment section below and let's all have a great discussion. Hit the like button for the love of MMOs and do subscribe to the channel if you're new here for more MMO content. Once again, I'm Adrian and I thank you for watching. Roses are red, violets are blue. If you want to watch more videos, click on these cards, anyone would do. And if you want to watch more videos, subscribe to the channel with the button down here. I know you want to.